Nobody expected Derek Fisher's story to end like this. For years, he was the guy you trusted when everything was on the line, the calm voice in a locker room full of egos, the player who always seemed to make the right decision when it mattered most. But somewhere along the way, those decisions started changing, and not in small ways. What followed wasn't a single mistake. It was a chain of choices that slowly erased everything he had built. And once the damage was done, there was no coming back. The man everyone trusted. Derek Fisher didn't become respected in the NBA by accident, and that's what makes everything that happened later so difficult to understand. He built his reputation step by step, not as a superstar who dominated headlines, but as the kind of player every championship team quietly depends on. Drafted by the Los Angeles Lakers, he entered a locker room filled with massive personalities, yet somehow managed to earn the trust of players who didn't easily give it. Kobe Bryant trusted him, Phil Jackson relied on him, and teammates saw him as someone who understood what it meant to win without needing the spotlight. That trust wasn't just talk. It showed up in the moments that mattered most. Fisher became known for delivering when the pressure was at its highest, hitting clutch shots in playoff games that could have gone either way. He wasn't the leading scorer, he wasn't the face of the franchise, but he was always there when the outcome was uncertain, and that consistency turned him into something more valuable than statistics. Inside the locker room, he was often described as the voice of reason, the player who could bridge the gap between stars and role players, and the one who kept things steady when everything else felt unstable. Over time, that role expanded beyond the court. Fisher became president of the Players' Union, a position that required not just leadership, but trust from hundreds of athletes across the league. That alone says everything about how he was viewed at his peak. He wasn't just respected by teammates, he was respected by the entire NBA community, including people who competed against him. His career stretched across multiple teams, from the Lakers to the Warriors, the Jazz, and later the Thunder, but his identity stayed the same: dependable, composed, and loyal. And maybe that's why what happened next hit so hard, because when someone builds their entire reputation on trust, it doesn't just crack when things go wrong, it shatters. And once people start questioning your character instead of your performance, there's no easy way to fix it. The line. He was never supposed to cross. The moment everything began to unravel didn't happen on the court, and that's exactly why it hit harder than any loss Derek Fisher had ever experienced. By the time he became head coach of the New York Knicks, he was supposed to be entering the next phase of his career, the one where former champions turn into leaders on the sidelines. He had the backing of Phil Jackson, a 5-year deal worth millions, and a roster that still believed in what he represented. On paper, everything looked like a natural transition. In reality, it was already starting to fall apart. The issue wasn't just that Fisher was struggling as a coach, it was what was happening outside the arena. His relationship with Gloria Govan, the former wife of his ex-teammate Matt Barnes, quickly turned into something far more serious than a typical celebrity headline. In the NBA, there are rules that aren't written down, but everyone understands them, and one of the most important is simple. You don't get involved with someone from your teammate's family. Fisher knew Barnes personally. They had shared time as teammates, and that history made the situation feel less like a coincidence and more like a decision. What made it worse wasn't just the relationship itself, but how far it went. Fisher wasn't staying distant from the situation. He was spending time at Govan's home, around Barnes's children, stepping into a space that many players viewed as completely off-limits. When Barnes found out, the reaction wasn't quiet or controlled. He drove to the house in Redondo Beach, and the confrontation between the two men turned physical. It wasn't just a fight, it was the public collapse of a relationship built on years of shared experience, and it spread across the league almost instantly. Inside NBA circles, this wasn't treated as gossip, it was seen as betrayal. Players talk, and when they do, reputations shift quickly. Fisher had built his entire identity on being trustworthy, the guy who did things the right way, the one who understood loyalty better than most. But now, that image was being questioned by the same people who once defended him, and once that doubt starts, it doesn't stay contained. It moves from player to player, from locker room to locker room, until it becomes the story everyone believes. At the same time, his position with the Knicks was becoming harder to defend. The team struggled to buy into his system. The triangle offense he brought from his playing days wasn't translating, and the losses began to pile up. But what made it impossible to separate was the timing. As the headlines about his personal life grew louder, his authority inside the locker room grew weaker. It's difficult to demand discipline from players when your own decisions are being questioned in public, and that contradiction didn't go unnoticed. By the time the Knicks started slipping in the standings, the damage had already been done. Fisher could say the two situations were unrelated, that his firing had nothing to do with the off-court drama, but perception doesn't work that way. In professional sports, especially at that level, image and leadership are tied together, and once one breaks, the other usually follows. When he was fired, it wasn't just seen as a coaching decision. It was viewed as the consequence of everything that had been building behind the scenes. And the most damaging part wasn't the headlines or the confrontation. It was the shift in how people saw him. Derek Fisher went from being someone players trusted without question to someone they looked at differently. Not with anger, not even with shock, but with distance. And in a league built on relationships, that distance is where everything begins to fall apart. When leadership stops working. By the time Derek Fisher was trying to establish himself as a head coach, the image that once made him powerful was already starting to work against him. Being respected as a player doesn't automatically translate into authority on the sideline, and in Fisher's case, that gap became impossible to ignore. He stepped into the New York Knicks job with confidence, backed by Phil Jackson and armed with the triangle offense he had learned during his championship years. The expectation wasn't just improvement, it was transformation. But almost immediately, things didn't look right. His first season set the tone in the worst possible way. The team finished with a record that became the lowest in franchise history, and while rebuilding teams can struggle, this felt different. There was confusion, inconsistency, and a lack of identity that players couldn't fully buy into. Fisher wasn't just introducing a system, he was asking players to believe in him as the leader of that system, and that belief never fully took hold. Even when the roster improved and the team showed brief signs of competitiveness, the foundation underneath still felt unstable. What made the situation more complicated was that Fisher didn't have the usual tools that experienced coaches rely on. He had never worked his way up through assistant roles, never learned how to manage a locker room from the sidelines before being put in charge of one. Instead, he was learning in real time, and in a city like New York, where every decision is magnified, there's very little room for that kind of trial and error. Players began to question not just the system, but the direction of the team, and once that doubt surfaces, it tends to spread quickly. Then came the stretch that ended everything. After hovering around a .500 record and briefly looking like a playoff team, the Knicks lost 9 out of 10 games, and the momentum disappeared almost overnight. Losing streaks happen in sports, but this one felt like confirmation of something deeper. It wasn't just that the team was losing, it was that they didn't look like they believed in what they were doing anymore. The structure Fisher was trying to build wasn't holding, and the timing couldn't have been worse given everything happening off the court. When the decision was made to fire him, it didn't feel shocking, it felt inevitable. What stood out more was how it was received. There wasn't a strong defense from players, no widespread pushback, no sense that the locker room had lost someone they couldn't replace. Instead, there was a kind of quiet acceptance, as if the outcome had already been understood before it was officially announced. And outside the team, the reaction was even harsher. Matt Barnes publicly mocked the situation, turning what was already a professional setback into something more personal and more humiliating. That moment marked a shift that Fisher couldn't easily reverse. As a player, he had built his career on being someone others relied on. As a coach, he was now seen as someone who couldn't maintain control. The difference between those two identities isn't just about wins and losses. It's about credibility, and once that credibility is gone, it doesn't come back quickly. The same league that once trusted him to lead now looked at him with uncertainty, and that uncertainty became the defining feature of his second career. The night everything collapsed. By the time Derek Fisher was trying to rebuild what was left of his reputation, the margin for error was already gone. He was no longer the respected veteran or the trusted leader, and after his coaching stint ended, the only thing he really had left was the possibility of starting over in a quieter role. But that possibility didn't last long, because one night on a California highway pushed everything past the point of recovery. It happened in the early hours when Fisher was driving on U.S. Route 101 through the Sherman Oaks area of Los Angeles. He was behind the wheel of a Cadillac Escalade with Gloria Govan in the passenger seat. As he approached an interchange, the vehicle suddenly veered onto the right shoulder, hitting the concrete curb and then the guardrail. The impact caused the SUV to flip over, and it came to rest on its roof, blocking multiple lanes of traffic. The scene could have easily turned fatal, not just for the two of them, but for anyone else on that stretch of highway at the time. Miraculously, neither Fisher nor Govan was seriously injured, and no other vehicles were involved. But what happened next mattered far more than the outcome of the crash itself. When officers from the California Highway Patrol arrived, they determined that Fisher had been drinking. After conducting a DUI test, he was arrested on suspicion of driving under the influence. This wasn't speculation or rumor, it was confirmed by authorities at the scene, and that distinction made it impossible to downplay or reinterpret. Fisher later entered a no-contest plea, a legal move that accepts punishment without formally admitting guilt. In practical terms, it meant he faced the full consequences under California law, including fines, license restrictions, and mandatory programs. But the legal penalties were only part of the story. What mattered more was how this incident reshaped whatever remained of his public image. At that point, there was no longer a debate about whether his reputation could recover. The conversation had shifted to whether it was already beyond repair. There was a short statement released afterward, where Fisher and Govan expressed gratitude that no one was hurt and thanked people for their support. What stood out, however, was what wasn't said. There was no direct acknowledgement of the DUI arrest, no detailed explanation, no attempt to address the seriousness of the decision that led to the crash. For many people watching from the outside, that silence felt like avoidance rather than accountability, and it only added to the growing perception that Fisher wasn't fully confronting the consequences of his actions. In isolation, a single mistake can sometimes be understood, even forgiven. But this didn't happen in isolation. It came after the controversy with Matt Barnes, after the questions about his leadership as a coach, after the visible decline in how he was perceived across the league. When people looked at this incident, they didn't see it as a one-time lapse. They saw it as confirmation of a pattern that had already been forming. And once something is viewed as a pattern, it becomes much harder to separate the person from the behavior, when the league moves on without you. What makes Derek Fisher's story different from many other fallen athletes is not just what he did, but what happened after. In professional sports, redemption is always possible, or at least it usually is. Players make mistakes, coaches fail, scandals come and go, and over time, many of them find their way back into the league in some form. They become analysts, assistant coaches, front office advisors, or even head coaches again. The system has a way of giving second chances, especially to people who once proved their value. But in Fisher's case, that return never really happened. After the DUI incident, there was a brief window where things could have been handled differently. He had the platform, the recognition, and the experience to address what happened in a way that might have shifted the narrative. Some former players in similar situations have chosen to take responsibility publicly, to speak about their mistakes, and to turn those moments into something constructive. Fisher didn't take that path in a meaningful way. The response felt controlled, limited, and incomplete, and over time, that lack of full accountability became part of how people understood his story. The basketball world didn't make a loud announcement about him, it simply moved on. Coaching positions opened up, and his name wasn't seriously considered. Broadcast networks continued to bring in former players, but his presence gradually faded from that space as well. There was no official statement, no clear rejection, just a quiet absence that became more noticeable the longer it lasted. In an industry built on relationships, reputation, and trust, that kind of silence says more than any public criticism ever could. Eventually, Fisher found himself in a very different environment, coaching at the high school level. On the surface, that might look like a fresh start, a chance to rebuild in a smaller, less intense setting. But even there, the past didn't completely disappear. Incidents on the sidelines, moments of tension, and public attention around his personal life continued to follow him, reminding everyone that the story hadn't been left behind. It wasn't the same stage, but the pattern still felt familiar. The financial consequences were significant, but they weren't the most important part. Losing a multi-year contract, missing out on future opportunities, and watching potential career paths close off all mattered, but what really defined the outcome was something less visible. It was the loss of trust. The same trust that once made him valuable as a player and gave him authority as a leader was no longer there. And without that, everything else becomes much harder to sustain. Looking back, it's easy to focus on the individual moments, the relationship that crossed a line, the coaching tenure that didn't work, the night of the crash that changed everything. But taken together, they tell a more complete story. Not of one bad decision, but of a series of choices that gradually shifted how Derek Fisher was seen, until the version people once respected no longer matched the reality they were watching. Derek Fisher went from a player everyone trusted in the biggest moments to someone the basketball world quietly moved on from. Do you think he deserves another chance, or did his own decisions make that impossible? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this.